Okay, calm down.
Christian, you have a new piece at Compact Magazine, and it is called Diversity is a Ruling Class Ideology. So what made you write this piece in the first place?
Well, one is just the prevalence of diversity as ideology, Ibram X. Kendi and Robin DiAngelo, this sort of stuff. It's everywhere, and it's in every workplace. So there's that element of it, but it's also rereading Federalist 10, really reading it. I'd read it in college or something, but in writing the Hamilton book, I read it, and it's an amazing document because it's the ruling class saying the quiet part out loud. And it was written by James Madison, and Madison was one of the, probably the most important driving force behind designing the Constitution. And the Constitution had to be ratified by 9 of the 13 states. And that ratification was actually not guaranteed. There was a lot of opposition to the Constitution because it created a very centralized and powerful state. And a lot of Americans felt, wait a minute, we just we fought a war to get rid of such a state. And now they've, a couple years after the fighting, there's this period of interregnum where there's a different document serving as the Constitution. It's called the Articles of Confederation. And, that left most power to the states, basically. And that leads to a crisis in the 1780s. And it's out of that crisis culminating in Shays' Rebellion, which is a class war by indebted farmers against the creditors who are bleeding them dry. And in response to that, they hold the Constitutional Convention, and they create the Constitution, which creates a very centralized and powerful state. And a lot of people did not like that. And so ratification of the Constitution, which required a majority vote in 9 states had to agree to ratifying the Constitution, and then all 13 states agreed that if 9 of us ratify this, then we'll all go along with it. But it was not at all clear that 9 states would ratify it. And so Madison, Hamilton, and John Jay got together and they wrote a series of essays, 85 essays in all, that are later known as the Federalist Papers. And each of these essays took on an argument against the Constitution, against ratification, and countered it and said, look, don't be concerned about that, blah, 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 blah. And so Madison in Federalist 10 addresses elites, and he says, many fear that if we have political democracy, this will lead directly to economic democracy, that political democracy will lead to class leveling. And the ruling class, the propertied classes in those days had no compunction whatsoever of being open and saying, we don't want that. Why would we do that? Wait, this is dangerous. You give common laborers the right to speak, the right to assemble, vote, even run for office. No, this is crazy. It's going to lead to economic democracy. They're going to come for our wealth and try and redistribute it. And so Madison said, don't worry about that. That's not that big a risk. He says, political democracy only threatens economic democracy if the majority of people who are effectively propertyless get together and oppose those who own most of the property. And he says it in those terms very, very explicitly. And he says, look, society has forever been riven by faction, and faction has myriad sources. It can be, religious belief, adherence to some political leader, geography, right? There's all sorts of sources of faction, as he calls it. And faction would be translated into our modern language as interest group, right? And there's infinite ways to sort of divide and define people's interests, right? And he said the risk of faction is only if that majority faction gets together. If the majority of people who are poor or propertyless get together and oppose the minority who own everything. And he says, so the solution to preventing that is to lean into the problem of faction, to encourage division among people, and to encourage a hypervariegation of interests. And I mean, that is essentially what modern diversity ideology does, is don't think of yourself as a worker. Don't think of yourself as an employee. Think of yourself as a subset of that. You are a trans worker. You are a worker who's a woman. You are a person of color. And you should think in these subcategories and not in the more universal category of being a worker, being someone who does not have property, etc. Right? So it's about think about other aspects of your interests, of your self-interest, other than the economic aspect. So that's
So did
what
he
that's what
explain how?
Federalist 10 argues is that so what we have to do is we have to proliferate faction. And if you do that, then you will make it impossible for the majority of the population to unite and wage, he doesn't say a class struggle, but that's what he's describing, to wage a struggle about who owns what, who gets what.